Hello, everyone, once again. Before I start, I would like to steal a minute of your time and add a minute to my presentation, just to say thank you for all of you who are here on site and online on Zoom, for making this conference happen, for making it valuable, because without you, this conference wouldn't make sense. And also for making it very relaxed and comfortable in regards to the atmosphere. I really appreciate that. And I would like to thank the Croatian Science Foundation for recognizing the significance of this research, as well as to every individual on the Music Academy and the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Research who helped us very much with the organization with this conference, which is hybrid in form, so it wouldn't go as smoothly as it did if they weren't here. So I think that's enough with thanks, and let's get back to my presentation. I will read it out because it's long, so just to stay in the period of 20 minutes. With this paper, I will give you a glance to my own doctoral research, which is basically a part of the project that hosted this symposium. So it deals with the early record industry in Croatia. Today, I'll focus on a part of the doctoral research that deals with the diasporic community, particularly in the US. And just to connect it or to follow up what Will or Patrick said in the other day, that record industry is basically all about business. In the end, I mean, I do agree with it. My part of the doctoral research deals with the market aspect of the record industry. But on the other side, I think that business has a lot to do with people, with the human part of that, and with the specific circumstances with life, just with that. So with this paper, I will try to humanize the record industry or the business part of the record industry. So this paper, and I really had a chance because this paper was inspired by one of my interlocutors, who is called Ivan or John Filčić, also known as Kolo John. Yeah, I think some of you in this room had the chance to meet him over 20th and 21st century. He's very important figure in the world of folk dance music in the US, but also in ex-Yugoslavia and Croatia. He is very important record seller and still is actually. This year, as amazing as it sounds, he will be celebrating his 99th birthday. And I was the lucky one that had the chance to organize a doctoral fieldwork in the US last May and to meet him in person in a small city of Peraluma, which is near San Francisco. He came there to attend statewide folk dance festival, not just to look at it, but also to sell his records and DVDs, as you can see here, and also to dance a little bit while he's there. I will show you a short video clip just to give you an idea of his very young spirit. At this point, you know two passions of Kolo John. The one is kolo, of course. The second one are records. For him, he doesn't necessarily divide them. For him, what doesn't exist without the other one. Why is that so? And this is to follow up on Rebecca. Well, when he started dancing back in the 1940s in California, he said that live music accompanying folk dances appeared very rarely, and maybe only for exhibitions, and only rarely even then. And then in the case of like accordion accompaniment or something similar. In other words, dances were from his experience regularly taught via gramophone records, which means that the records were a necessity in the Balkan folk dance world of the US from his experience of that time, 1940s, 1950s maybe. However, my research does not focus on records containing folk dances. Rather than that, I tried to find out whether 3 Zagreb record companies reached the US, the companies that you've heard about a little bit in Jelka and Joško's lectures. If they did reach, I wanted to know who was the audience, or in other words, was it sold primarily to diasporic communities? Then I wanted to know which repertoire sold the best and which didn't sell at all. Other tasks were to see who were the sellers and what were their profiles, marketing strategies, etc. This is also just a small regard, a brief digression to David Crockett, we had a comment about him the other day. Somebody asked whether we have Yugoslavian version of David Crockett. Well, it seems, according to this insert from the Zajedničar newspaper, that maybe Yugoslav diaspora had its own version of David Crockett in the figure of Mate Krakić or singer Mate Krakić, but not in the sense of a postman womanizer, rather than like a Dalmatian hero or folk hero from that aspect. Let's get back to the research. The research was done primarily through archive, online and digital archive research, and it showed that from those three record companies, Edison, Belpen, Kala, Electroton, and Yugoton, only the last one reached US record stores, Yugoton. The most important source turned out to be newspaper called Zajedničar, issued by Croatian Fraternal Union in Pittsburgh, which also happens to be the biggest center of Croatian diaspora throughout the 20th century. This newspaper features a list of advertisements for record stores that sold music for Yugoslav diaspora. The number is not big. We are talking about a dozen of sellers in this period of 78s and early vinyl. Now I'm referring to the period after the Second World War to 1959. It is also where I found John Pilčić. A short note on why not the earlier period. To put it very simply in John's words, Victor and Columbia record companies had monopoly in record production, and it lasted until the end of the Second World War. These were the times when an individual couldn't afford all machinery needed for record production. Very logical remark, which is also not a new fact in these circles. And let me take you on a quick tour through Zajedničar advertisements. Advertisements for record sellers look very similar, as you can see on this slide. They sometimes list a shop name, a shop owner, address, sometimes new or available records, and so on. Not much apart from that is actually available, and only a handful of names that are listed on these advertisements could be investigated further. I grouped them according to the addresses that are listed in almost all of them, and I got the map that looks like this. It shows the main centers of Croatian diaspora within US borders, which are the leader, of course, Pittsburgh and the area around Cleveland, Youngstown, including Chicago and Detroit. Some of Yugoslav people went to New York, and some of the lucky ones, let's say, went to California, to San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles. An interesting fact is also not a new fact, but people from coastal part of Croatia, or generally like Adriatic Sea, went to the California because they were skilled in sea-related jobs, while the people that lived in these inner parts of the US, basically, majority of them worked in the steel mills. So it's also a known fact that they struggled for a long time with poor economic and social status. However, there were some exceptions that rose high in class, even among them very early in the 20th century. And one such example was John Palandić, or originally Ivan Palandacic, who was a Montenegrin that became renowned politician and entrepreneur in Chicago, well-known publisher and main competitor to John Pilčić's record-selling business after the Second World War. His shop was named Palandić Bookstore, and we'll hear about him in a minute. But for those of you who want to know more about his life, maybe you can find it in a very good article by Vladimir Fischer-Nebmeyer, which was published in 2019. Now let's go back to the John Pilčić, who initially started in Gary, Indiana, near Chicago. His father immigrated around First World War due to the war situation in these parts of Europe, and John followed around 1930s from what is today a Croatian city of Rijeka, as well as his mom and his little sister. He also has a little brother, but he was born in the US. John told me that he was also predestined to work in a steel mill, and he started working there. But he was of poor health, so he was sent to Arizona to recover for 5 years, where he also learned Spanish. And from there, he didn't return back to the steel mill business, but he went to California to work as a record seller. And his life will serve as a great example of a record seller in the 1940s and 1950s. Last May, we talked for quite some time, and we covered a lot of topics: free stores, his customers, competition, ethnic identifications, prices, childhood, past, etc. So I will not cover all these topics, just some that can answer my research questions listed before. I will quote him. We will start with his 3 stores, and I will quote John Piltich now. I had 3 stores, one in Oakland, one in San Francisco, and one in Los Angeles. I opened one in Oakland first in 1948 or 1949. I don't remember exactly. At that time, I had a competitor in San Francisco. The man was called Ed Kremer, but his wife didn't support him being in the store whole day, never at home, just on Sundays. So she told him, get rid of it. And that's when he came to me and suggested to buy the store from him. And I did. He sold me everything for $1,200. It was a really good bargain. End of quote. This was an example of how a record seller expanded his business. Later on, John opened up the store in LA across the Greek Orthodox Church, buying up the store in the similar fashion to help the previous owner retire. I couldn't find when exactly that happened. Now, that store in LA, he said, had the biggest success of all 3 stores. The secret was in the strategic location that was surrounded by other Greek shops with cheese, delicatessen, and other interesting Greek stuff. So his store was actually just one stop on Greek Sunday morning shopping spree in LA. And an interesting note is that his working days were from Monday to Sunday. In other words, he would go a whole month without a day off. All 3 of John's stores were active at the, I think somebody has a microphone. Somebody didn't mute himself. What? Yeah. So all 3 of John's stores were active at the same time for roughly 10 to 15 years. And first one to close was one in Oakland due to highway construction, which relocated businesses and citizens. And the last one to close was one in Los Angeles. And now that you have a wider picture of John's business, let's zoom it in. Imagine you are entering his store in San Francisco. And there at the counter, you wouldn't find him, but you would find his employee, who was the very same guy who sold him the place, Ed Kremer. And this fact actually mirrors John's marketing strategy. I'll explain it in his words. I quote, Mr. Kremer asked me if he could stay and work. And I thought, sure, why not? These people here in San Francisco, they already know him and they love him. So instead of letting people know it was my store, I let them think it was still Mr. Kremer's store. It was my advantage, actually, since I wasn't as popular as he was. End of quote. Now imagine you're looking around the store, and there you would find various ethnic records, not just for South Slavic community, but as John likes to put it, I had international repertoire, I had everything, Jewish, African, Chinese, everything. And if I had John's sales catalog from back then, it would be much easier to decipher what exactly means everything, but I couldn't get to it. Anyhow, this affinity to international repertoire mirrors John's personal skills, as he's really proud of several languages he can speak. Croatian, English, Spanish, Greek, Polish, Russian, German, and a little bit of Italian. And these skills have helped him with his multi-ethnic customers, of course. Then, if you were a South Slav entering his store, you could buy records recorded and published in the US by several minor record labels, such as Balkan, Slavton, Corona, Stenchel, Sonar, and so on. But they costed 89 cents per piece. You could also buy ethnic records, such as Victor and Columbia. The latter costed 10 cents less. But this wasn't as profitable because sellers couldn't bargain with big companies for the wholesale price like they could with indie labels. And the most expensive records were Kolo Festival records issued by John Piltich, so his own ethnic label, and they costed $1.05. And if you were a customer from, let's say, South Africa, New Zealand, or Australia, and wanted to buy some records from John Piltich, since you saw his advertisements from your cousins that live in the US, for example, you could order them via mail. It was through the system of money orders, and he sent the records that far, mainly for the people from the coastal part of Croatia. Apart from the records issued in the US, John also sold records that were imported from Yugoslavia, primarily Yugoton records. And these were the quality stuff, John said, good and professional, almost perfect in comparison to the indie records published in the US. According to John, he had an exclusive deal with early Yugoton, but only for a short time during 1950s. Yugoton would sell him some records intended for diaspora at lower price, and he would sell it to the customers and the US retailers. But since John couldn't sell the amount Yugoton expected, they terminated the deal. And I quote, "The people in Yugoton weren't aware of the situation in the US. they would say to me, you have 150 million people there. Why don't you sell more? But I thought, who would buy this? My customers were primarily folk dancers, not people who would be interested in these songs. I will get back to the customer part in a minute. If I have, I don't know how.
Yes.
Okay, let me just say a few more things regarding records recorded in Yugoslavia that reached John's store. I was analyzing the list of records in Zagreb advertisements and John's advertisements, and one can deduce that the records marked as recorded in Yugoslavia also featured recordings not only from Yugoton, but recordings that were, for example, issued on Yugodisk Records, a label affiliated with Radio Belgrade in the mid-1950s. However, John said he wasn't dealing with Yugodisk. So digging deeper to find out how Yugodisk came in the US, I found some records issued by Balkan Record Company in US that had a note recorded in Yugoslavia, Yugoslav Radio. This is pointing out not to Yugodisk, but to some sort of a deal between Balkan Record Company and Yugoslav Radio diffuser, maybe. Due to the lack of materials, I couldn't find more details, but it looks like Yugoton, who collaborated with Yugoslav radios, maybe had it rough competing with his own partners in the US. And other Yugoton records were also published on American continent, more exactly in Canada, on Permanent records that were available for purchase in, for example, John Palandic store in Chicago. And with this, we will hop to the next category, next kaleidoscopic bubble, to that of the Pilčić competition. I would say that this part of our conversation will humanize the source and names, because before I met Pilčić, I had his company not under his name, but under the name of Slav Art Music Company. So I perceived him not as a person, but as a company. So let me humanize a list of the companies on the previous screen, starting with his two biggest competitors, both from Chicago, first of which is John Palandic, and the second is Ivan Hlad with his Balkan Music Company. I quote, Palandic, I know them. Those were the two brothers. I was there at their store. I bought some things from them. They published one very, very good songbook, which I sold in my stores as well. Everybody bought that songbook. It had all the popular folk songs of the time. They bought some Yugoton records from me. He meant Omladinka songbook. I asked Pilčić if he was a friend with Palandic, and he responded, no, they weren't very likable. Why, I asked. Well, I was Croatian and they were Orthodox. They would identify themselves as Orthodox, not Serbian. End of quote. Now, this instance mirrors the tense political situation between Catholic and Orthodox South Slav people that sharpened during and after the Second World War. And it seems as though Yugoslavian countries emphasized their nationality, so the differences became more and more important. And this complex political situation is one of the reasons why John Pilčić had to change the name of his store from Yugoslav Record Company or Yugoslav Record Shop to Slav Art Music Company shortly after establishing it. He had to camouflage the word Yugoslav that became a thorn in the eye for political refugees after the Second World War, who often had a reputation of troublemakers in that part of the US. Other competitor, Ivan Hlad, Pilčić described as follows. His company was called Hlad Balkan Music, active in Chicago. There were two Ivan Hlads, father and the son. The father was a popular tamburica manufacturer. The son started selling records. But something happened and their relationship broke. I think that they both died without knowing about each other. That's a pity, but it's the truth. Our conversation continued with listing some other record sellers from the map. Charlene Music Corner, for example. I met Charlene in Pittsburgh. She sold only local record labels issued around Pittsburgh. She was a pretty woman, but she died young. Croatian. She sang and led some folk dance ensembles. She was a proper folk dance artist. I asked, for example, for Michelin from Cleveland, and John said he was a Slovenian good one. And finally, let's go to the topic of customers and answer the question, who were the customers of John Pilčić? Very unexpectedly, he answered this question as following. Americans were my most important customers. These people here, referring to the people who were at the statewide folk dance festival, where I met him, of whom no one, except for Pilčić, was of South Slavic origin, but still they danced South Slavic dances and Balkan dances in general. Records with kolo music was bought by these people. Croatian people didn't buy kolo music. End of quote. This mark mirrors the other very interesting question of why so many Americans actively participated in specific Balkan cultural practices to which they have no family or ethnic connection during the second half of the 20th century. This topic was very insightfully dealt by Mirjana Laušević in her book Balkan Fascinations, so I'll skip it in this presentation. But let's go back to the customers and preferred repertoire in John's store. According to his business, ethnic records with pop songs imported from Yugoslavia weren't so popular in the US, despite their growing popularity in homeland. He made an example with very popular singer Ivo Robić, who we heard before, who was an icon in ex-Yugoslavia. I quote, "I had one record with Ivo Robić singing cowboy songs in English, which people mocked and laughed at, because Ivo Robić couldn't speak English. He didn't understand it. He had a strong accent." And why was that so? John explained as following. Because what people brought in America as immigrants, that's what they had in their heart until the end. Dalmatian people that immigrated in the US before the Second World War, many of whom came to California, only knew folk songs like Ja sam majko cura fina and Jedan mali brodić. They wanted that. Very popular song was Mirjana, Pospaj paljetak. I sold so many records with that. Everybody bought Mirjana. Kukavica was very popular as well. End of quote. Although John couldn't sell pop songs, he could sell newly composed Dalmatian songs, like Knežević songs, inspired by folk songs that became enormously popular in Yugoslavia in the second half of the 20th century. The reason he could sell newly composed Dalmatian songs was probably better conditions of travel to homeland and the better chance to become acquainted with the current repertoire in homeland in regards to diaspora traveling home for vacation and then back to the US. And finally, let me refer to this small bubble with the word collector and prepare the terrain for our next two presenters. John considers himself as a collector who still has quite an amount of records of various types, cassettes and CDs. His 78s are being kept in the storage in LA, maybe he already transferred them somewhere. He tends to give the collection and already has a few names in mind. And I like to conclude this paper with a picture from my memory, him smiling at me after walking down the road from the hall where the festival was organized. And he was so grateful to be able to speak Croatian after such a long time and to be able to go through his life remembering all the good things. When he told me, "I'm so glad to have made a new friend," I was so emotionally overwhelmed that I couldn't stop crying for the next few days when I was retelling people my experience with John. And it was probably his incredible energy and memory that I admire. And I'm aware of how lucky I am to have had the chance to meet him, not just because this meeting enabled me to, let's say, trick the research dealing with the past, considering I was given all the information from the first hand, but also because it helped me understand human moment in this archive research and made me cherish him as an amazing person he turned out to be. And that's it.